We are finishing up our series together of the life of Abraham. And we're going through several chapters trying to summarize some of this stuff up. But I do want to share that with you. So if you have in your Bibles, and turn to really chapters 23, 24, and 25. Now we're not going to read all of those. I want you to understand that. But to summarize his life together, that's where I want us to focus on. One of my favorite camp songs that I sing just about every year, either at campfire or sometime during the week, is a song called, "Oh God, You Are My God, and I Will Forever Praise You." And then it has this line in there, "And step by step you lead me, and I will follow you all my days." Have you heard that song before? We probably sang it here at church. And that song is kind of a testimony, as we sing that, of us following God all of our days. Living it out continually, not quitting in the pursuit of God. And I hope that church is an encouragement for you in that way as well, of understanding that we are pursuing God's life, not just early on, not just something that we early attracted to, but something that we continue to do throughout our life's span. And I think that's a great way to sum up the life of Abraham together as we come more to the end of his life. And so today we are going to say goodbye to Abraham, and I think it's appropriate we do so because we've been with him for about 16 weeks. Now that's kind of a long time, I understand that, but I think we've had a good journey all during that time. It's a long time, but I've noticed that he really did follow God all of his days. And here's the deal. No matter how old you are, whether you're 5, 25, 55, or 95, if you are here today, I hope that you receive this and pursue that life of finishing the race of life and finishing that faithfully. Faithfully finishing out your life in adamancy that you are pursuing God through the rest of your days. So no matter how old you are, understand this is supposed to be a teaching of encouragement for you. But understand this, it's mostly for the older folks. But that's okay. Maybe you can learn something out of this. One of the jokes I like listening to is Jeff Foxworthy's "You Might Be a Redneck If." You like those? I really like those because often they pertain to me, or around me, or to some degree, or a future reference of what I will do at some point. Maybe you like those as well. But let's reformat that a little bit of "you might be getting old if." Shall we do that? I might be in dangerous water here this morning. So hey, no throwing anything at me, no dentures, no nothing, okay? Don't be throwing at me. But here's the deal. You might be getting old with, or you might be getting too old to drive if. You ready? You might be getting too old to drive if it takes you 4 minutes to get out of the car. You might be getting a little bit old. You might be getting a little old if you back up until you hear a crunch. You might be getting too old to drive. You might be getting too old to drive if driving the speed limit scares you. You might be getting too old to drive. If your cruise control is there so your leg doesn't fall asleep, you might be getting too old to drive. If your cruise control can be set at 26 miles an hour and you are happy about that, you might be getting too old to drive. If you inquire at your dealership that you would like to purchase a mirrored glass or a magnifying glass across your windshield, and if that could be possible, you might be getting too old to drive. If your turn signal has been on since 2003, you might be too old to drive. If your bumper sticker says, "I like Ike," you might be getting too old to drive. At some point, maybe we might need to stop driving. At some point, that might be coming. But at some point, we need to realize also that when it comes to us in this walk of faith and pursuing that, that's something that needs to be continuing on. Our pilgrimage, our journeying with Jesus Christ is something that continues and doesn't stop. Because the child of God lives a life of faith. And that faith needs to be a faith to the finish. We might run out of gas on our way at some point. But we need to continue and never run out of hope. What do I mean by hope? Well, I think the life of Abraham is a great example for us in this. To be a hope that never finishes living out and living by the promise that God established. You see, finishing faith is a hard concept a lot for younger folks to understand. because we have abilities, because we have talents, because we have strength and energy, because we don't have aches like some others might. And in our youthfulness, we don't have the experience of aging as much, or pain as much, or frailty, or this idea of mourning, because mourning happens as you age. And I think we need to look at the first two verses of chapter 23 together and understand towards the end of Abraham's life how that journey he continued in faithfulness. Here's what we see. And when Sarah was 127 years old, she died at Kiriath Arba, which is now Hebron, in the land of Canaan. And Abraham mourned and wept for her. A couple things I think this says in these two verses that you and I need to understand. Sarah is the only one and the only woman in all the Bible where it mentions her age. Okay? I think that's very interesting because that tells an indication of a lot about how important she is to the story. A couple other things I think that you need to see. In the first account of this ever of the whole entire Bible, do we see a funeral service and funeral preparations prepared for her. And this chapter deals with the negotiations between Abraham and him coming up with a place to bury his wife. And the third thing is, it's the first time that the Bible ever mentions about weeping and crying in this way. Now, there are other places in the Bible, and there are other places in the 22 chapters, or the 22 chapters that we have been going through the life of Abraham. There's a lot of experiences there where there is moments of sorrow, there's moments of sadness, but this is the first time we ever see weeping. And I think it's very personal on this effect because we need to understand that the spiritual does not mean that we are just stoic people. Because often when we experience death or we see death, we experience that a little bit different as a Christian. Because we realize there is a hope in tomorrow. There's a hope for the future. But I hope that doesn't make us stoic. I hope that makes us more compassionate. I hope it makes us more emotional to know that Jesus weeps with us and that He cares about for us and that we are excited about things to come. But death can take Sarah out of the arms of Abraham, but cannot take her out of his heart. So don't be stoic when it comes to things like this. Her passing was not just a time of sorrow, but it was also another time of testing for Abraham. And I want you and I to see that. Her death creates a dilemma because the recipients of the promise that is going to continue on through Abraham's people, through Abraham's family, all of this hasn't been delivered yet. Sarah's dying doesn't complicate a whole bunch of things, but nevertheless, it is a trial at this point. And what's sad about this is all the fulfillment that God is going to do hasn't been done yet. And so there's a lot of questions that are still up in the air. And if you are young, you need to understand that just because you might be able to live life longer, or there are some people who are living life longer, doesn't mean that the road gets easier. Often the trials and the road gets rockier as you go on down the lane. And living by promise is hard when suddenly people around you that you love and admire are dying off. And that can be hard for us. It's going to be hard for us because we don't like seeing that. We don't like experiencing that. It's hard for us and often can make life a lot harder. And when people that we've loved a long time are getting older and getting sicker and are passing, it can often trouble us in some ways too. One of the greatest preachers over the last century was by the name of Dr. Carmel Barnes. And what he did was during World War II, he taught at a seminary. And he had all these preachers come, and these young men, and he would teach them as they would go into ministry and head out the door. But they would come up with some questions for him, and often he was quick to answer those. But when it came to the idea of the resurrection, one of the men brought up the idea, well, what about the resurrection? Because this is a key part of our faith. And I want to discuss some of these things as this idea of the suffering of Jesus Christ and all this type of stuff. It's a key critical moment here at the crucifixion and resurrection of Jesus Christ. Can we discuss that a little bit more? He goes, I don't think I want to discuss that any more than what it is right there in Scripture. Because he said this, when you're under 30 years old, you haven't experienced a lot of suffering. When you're under 30 years old, you haven't experienced a lot of defeat or failure in your life. Often you haven't experienced things like heartbreak to that type of point. And until you experience life to that type of magnitude, until you understand those type of things, this world is not going to make sense because this world is such a harsh world, which only makes sense if Jesus Christ raised from the dead. And that was the point that he was making. You see, walking by faith doesn't get easier just because we get older. Because notice how Abraham is going to model a finishing faith for you and I. He is going to follow God all of his days. And there are three ways that he is going to show this. The first way is this. He is mindful of the promise by burying Sarah. Let's continue on in our passage in verse 3 of chapter 23. Then leaving her body, he said to the Hittite elders, I am here, a stranger, a foreigner among you. Please sell me a piece of land so I can give my wife a proper burial. And we are going to read not all of this chapter, understand this, but I want to emphasize a couple things. But he goes into negotiation with some of the local men around to get Sarah a piece of land in which he can bury her. And here's the deal. All scholars agree when they talk about this verse that Abraham got ripped off. What he paid for this piece of land was far more than what he should have. So he goes to the man who owns the piece of land that he desires, whose name is Ephron, and says, Can I have this piece of land? And the man actually starts off and says, you can just have the land. But that was just politeness, and Abraham knew that. But Abraham says, no, I'll pay for it. And so Ephraim says, well, it's worth 400 shekels of silver to me, which was way more than what it was worth. And so taking advantage of grieving people is not a new thing. Understand that. But here's what we continue on in verse 16 of chapter 23. So Abraham agreed with Ephraim's price and paid the amount that he suggested, 400 pieces of silver, weighed according to the market standard. And the Hittite elders witnessed the transaction. And so Abraham brought a plot of land belonging to Ephraim at Machpelah. It's hard for me to read. Not just you, buddy. Even for me, when it comes to these names. Machpelah. There we go. Near Mamre. And included the field itself, a cave that was on it, and all the surrounding trees. It was transferred from Abraham as his permanent possession into the presence of the Hittite elders at the city gates. And when Abraham buried his wife Sarah in Canaan, in the cave of Machpelah, near Mamre, also called Hebron, to the field and the cave he transferred from the Hittite to Abraham to use as a permanent burying place. Now you might be asking yourself, Seth, you just suffered through that yourself. Why would you even pick that verse? Here's what I want you to understand from reading passages like this. Why is this important to us? Because this grief that Abraham is expressing is a testimony. It's not just a testimony to his people, but it's a testimony to the people that he's surrounded by. That's why we need to know that. When we experience grief in our life, it is a form of testimony, and that can be displayed whether good or bad. Understand that. But the way we grieve does send a message to people. The way Abraham makes these funeral arrangements speaks of his faith in a couple ways. One of the ways that we will notice that it speaks of his faith as it affirmed his intentional lifestyle as he lived it completely differently from the people that he was surrounded by. He lived a distinctly different way in accordance to what God wanted. And he came to them, and he had been living around these people for a long time. And when he addresses them, he says this, I am a stranger among you. I am a foreigner among you. Now, Abraham was a good neighbor, but understand he was not good at accommodating with these people. Meaning this, he didn't celebrate their customs. He didn't celebrate with their religions. He didn't live their lifestyles. He lived among them for years as just he was visiting there. That's how Abraham lived amongst them. Why? Well, the Hebrew writer tells us this in Hebrews chapter 11, verse 13. It says this, all these people died still believing that what God had promised them, and they did not receive what he
And they did not receive what was promised, but they saw it from a distance and welcomed it. They agreed that they were foreigners and nomads in this earth. Obviously, people who say such things look forward to the country that they are called to of their own. And if they are no longer in their country or where they came from, they would have gone back. But they were looking for a better place, a heavenly homeland. And that is why God is not ashamed to call them their God. For he has prepared for them a city for them. When he comes up to these people, these Hittite people, he says this: I am a stranger. He says, I am a foreigner. I am an alien among you. And what Abraham is doing is subtly referencing that he is not a citizen of this world. That is subtly what Abraham is doing in this moment. But here is what also the testimony speaks of as we read this passage. Notice he doesn't follow a long-established practice of taking his family back to the homeland. That's a tradition that we often do. There are people who live far off from Clay County who will die, and they will haul their bones back here so they can be buried in the family plot. That is something that we do. That's part of our tradition. That's a part of our culture. But that is not what Abraham does. Instead, what Abraham does, it says, no, I want Sarah to be buried here. We are not part of that place anymore. I want her to be buried here. It's interesting, though, that even though God's promised Abraham this entire land where Sarah is buried on, even though he has offered this to him and says, this will be your descendants' place, Abraham didn't own an inch of it except for this burial plot. That's all Abraham owned. Why? The same reason he built the altars to God. The same reason that he picked up his tent pegs and went around and went and built other altars and planted tamarisk trees. Abraham was claiming God's promise that this one day, as I stake it out, will be ours. God told him in a dream, your descendants are going to go away for 400 years and be enslaved in the land of a different country until the sins of the Amorites are progressing. But they are going to come back here and you will get the land. So Abraham is claiming it as an act of symbolic pledge for his descendants that one day will receive this promised land. It did inspire his descendants because his great-grandson was Joseph. Remember, Joseph, we did a whole study on him. And as Joseph was in the land and saved not just Egypt, but also saved his family and saved the promise and continued that on, we see that here's what Joseph says himself about leaving that place. He lived by faith in this way when it says in Hebrews chapter 11, verse 22, it was by faith that Joseph, when he was about to die, he confidently said to his people that Israel would leave Egypt. And then he commanded them to take his bones with them when they left. You see, he would go down to Egypt, but he realized this isn't the place where we need to stay. This is something that would happen 400 years later, but Joseph spoke about it confidently. It gave great instruction even about his bones, and it even goes into detail on that in Genesis chapter 50, saying, take me back to Canaan, take me back to where my grandpa is buried, take me back to where grandma is buried, because that is where home is. Abraham grieves, but it doesn't conceal his faith. It confirms his faith and what they believe and shows that in action, because finishing faith declares that death and doesn't just bury the promise of God. The promise of God continues. And he is mindful of this promise by burying Sarah. Here's the other thing that we see in this passage that you and I need to understand as a point. He is mindful of the promise by also marrying off Isaac. Now, I think this is important to see because Sarah's passing wasn't just hard on Abraham. It impacted their son, Isaac, greatly. In fact, Isaac goes into mourning as well. And Abraham knows that Isaac doesn't need another mother. What Isaac needs is a wife, which he doesn't have. He needs a wife because there is a problem when it comes to continuing this promise because the descendants, it's about the descendants that are come, and this boy isn't married yet. Something has to happen here. So that's why we are skipping over to chapter 24, starting in verse 1. Abraham was now very old, and the Lord had blessed him in every way. One day Abraham said to his oldest servant, the man in charge of his household, Take an oath by putting your hand under my thigh. Swear by the Lord, the God of heaven and earth, that you will not allow my son to marry one of these local Canaanite women. Go instead to my homeland, to the relatives, and find a wife there for my son Isaac." And the servant asked, "But what if I can't find a young woman who is willing to travel so far from home? Should I then take Isaac to live among your relatives in the land that you came from?" "No," Abraham responded. "Be careful to never take my son there." Think about this. Isaac has got to get married. For this promise of faith to continue, he has to get married. And the boy is now 27 years old, living with dad. He's got to get married. This has to happen. And Isaac isn't there yet. And Abraham says, "Don't let him marry one of these Canaanite women. They're not suitable. Don't take him back to my country. Here's what I want you to do." Now think about that. If you were the servant. Wait, well, that kind of limits my options there a little bit. Which dating site should I use then, Abraham? Well, hang on here. Well, one of the options is to go and find a Canaanite woman, but that's not going to work. But I've got to go convince somebody back from the homeland. I've got to convince someone to come here to live in a tent. I've got to convince someone to come here to marry somebody that she's never met. I mean, that really kind of makes it tough on me. But listen to the faith of Abraham as he responds to this servant. In chapter 24, verse 7, he says this, "For the Lord, the God of heaven, who took me from my father's house and my native land, solemnly promised to give this land to my descendants. He will send his angel ahead of you, and he will see to it that you will find a wife there for my son." Do you see the faith there on Abraham's part? Do you see the faith displayed that, hey, God will fulfill these things. God will work these things out. Isaac has got to be married for the promise to be fulfilled. Abraham says, what he doesn't say, "Don't get away from here because these women are destined for destruction." Abraham says, "Go, don't take him back to my people, but you go." And he wanted Isaac to have a wife who believed in the promise just as much as Abraham's wife Sarah did and held to that promise. Notice the confidence that Abraham has in God as he responds in this way. He believed so much in the promise that the servant brought up a reasonable objection for why this plan probably isn't going to work out too well. But he responds, "An angel is going to go ahead of you and God will fulfill this." Abraham has come to believe in the supernatural in a great way that is behind the promise of God. And he saw it most of all in the birth of his own son Isaac as he came to be. God will do what God has to do. Even though we can't see it, there's unseen spiritual reality at work in what God does. And the promise will be fulfilled. Again, we see Abraham in his last days living by his first priorities, setting God as the focus and following him all the way. Here's what we see. Genesis chapter 24. Skipping down to 67. Be glad I didn't read from 7 all the way down to 67, okay? Here's what it says in 67. "And Isaac brought Rebekah into his mother's Sarah's tent, and she became his wife. And he loved her deeply, and she was a special comfort to him after the death of his mother." You see, Abraham, even in his last days, facing this final test, he still sees everything through the lens of the promise. And hopefully we see that too. And it was through the lens of promise that he buried his wife. It was through the lens of promise that he married off his son. And notice he is mindful of the promise, will carry on. Abraham did not stop living, and Abraham didn't stop loving even after Sarah died. It was almost a year to the day from when my grandmother Mary died to my grandfather Larry dying. Usually, sometimes that happens because of heartstrings and everything else. And sometimes we almost think that as an expectation that soon dad or mom are going to follow after mom or dad. Usually we see that happening, right? But Abraham continues on living. and walking and going. And it's a very strange chapter that tells about the end of his life, but I want us to see it here in chapter 25, verse 6. Abraham married another wife. Her name was Keturah, and she gave birth to Zimran and Keshan and Midian and Ishbak and Shurah. And Shuran was the father of Sheba and Dedan, and Dedan's descendants were Asherites and Lechusites and Lumerites, I'm assuming, and Midianites, sons of Ephraim, Epher, Hanok, Adibah, and Elbah, and were all descendants of Abraham through Keturah. Abraham gave everything he owned to his son Isaac. But before he died, he gave gifts to his son and his concubines and sent them off from the land to the east away from Isaac. I don't know if this little glimpse of Abraham's life bothers you much, the fact that Abraham married again after his wife Sarah. And in a lot of ways, sometimes that might leave us a little bit sour. But Keturah didn't replace Sarah whatsoever. He didn't replace Sarah in Abraham's heart. He would die, Abraham would go and die, and he would be buried next to Sarah. That's how much he loved her. But his second marriage indicated that he did not intend to stop living before he died. And here's the thing, it's a strange experience when your parents, who have lost one of them, start dating or get remarried. It's a very, very strange experience to be going through as a son or daughter, or to see that happen. And we kind of wonder, well, what is going on here? It's a strange experience to watch someone date in that way. And often, really, it's a tribute to that spouse. Because they didn't expect that person to die. They didn't expect their spouse to die. And often it can be attributed to them because they wouldn't really want to go on life living without having them. They were so used to living with one another and having someone close to them in that way. And it's not replacing as often it is as attributing to them. And I think that's what Abraham did here. He didn't stop living before he died. And the same work that God did in producing Isaac continued working through Keturah, because Abraham had 6 more kids. Amazing how we see how God can produce things out of dead bodies. And this is an evidence of his faithfulness. Why? Because chapter 17, he changed his name from the father, Abraham, a father, to Abraham, which means father of nations. God even fulfilled that, plural. Again, God can keep his promises. And remember the lesson of Ishmael. He gave these boys gifts and sent them on their way because they were his sons, but they weren't the son of promise like Isaac was. And after the child of promise should remain in the land of promise. And at the very end, Abraham ordered his whole life surrounding the fulfillment of God in his promise. And this is something to bring about this experience of people who have a faith but need to finish that and finish it out faithfully. I know from personal experience because I have seen people finish their faith strong. And I want to be one of those. I want to act that way. I want to live my life strong to the finish. Now, I've seen some other people who I've admired through my years and have been pillars of godliness and things like that. But as they've gotten older, they've gotten bitter. And I don't want to be like that. I don't want to be that type of person. I want to be the type of person that finishes well. I want to be an encourager. And I hope that you want to be too. And we need to remind each other as we come to church to remember to finish that faith strong as we walk the race set before us. We need to be encouragers. And we need to remind one another to be that way, that we want to be that type of person. And if God gives you grace to have 50, 60, 90 years, most of the people who you walk with at their funeral are going only to remember the last 10 and how you lived. People who have probably walked with you a lot in life, really they're going to remember the last 10 of how you lived your life. In most funerals that I've done for people, I've only known them the last couple years of their life. And we remember how we finish. And we want to be remembered well. We remember having a faith to finish because it's, for the faithful, the finish isn't the end. I think that's one of the things we need to be reminded of. Abraham, all of his life, was a pilgrim, not living in a land that was his. And if you are a pilgrim and you get to the end of your pilgrimage, the end of your pilgrimage is not death. The end of your pilgrimage is home. That place that you're looking for, that place where it's established, that is what the end looks like. And when you get to the end of your pilgrimage, it isn't over. It's home. Notice how the Scripture ends Abraham's pilgrimage in verse 7 of chapter 25. Abraham lived 175 years, and then Abraham breathed his last and died at a good old age, and an old man full of years, and he was gathered with his people. I think it's interesting how Scripture ends Abraham's life. It says this: he was gathered to his people. I like that. I can't wait to be gathered to my people. Can you? I can't wait to be gathered to my people. And this is what the writer is talking about. He's talking about that great company of people who had faith to finish. Not about a field of bones. Not about being gathered and going back to the family plot and be buried there by everyone else. That's not what he's talking about, being gathered to your people. Because the Sadducees try to indicate that with Jesus and kind of go toe-to-toe with him a little bit. And Jesus proves the reality that death is not the end. In Matthew chapter 22, starting in verse 29, he responds to the Sadducees and their criticism in this way. Jesus replied, "You are in error because you do not know Scripture or the power of God. At the resurrection of people will neither marry nor will be given in marriage. They will be like the angels in heaven. But about the resurrection of the dead, have you not read what God has said to you? I am the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob. He is not the God of the dead. No, He is the God of the living." See, the end is not death. The end is a banquet. And we will come from the east, from the west, from the north and the south, and we will feast with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob and Jesus. We will be gathered to the people. Tom Long, who is a homiletics professor at Princeton Seminary, left and went on a little bit of a journey back to where he was as a young man. And he was a student minister at a church a long, long time ago. And he went back to that church just to visit, because it had been a long time since he had been there. And he recalled a lady who was in the audience as he sat there with everyone else. And he knew her. Some new faces were there and some other people were there. But she was the daughter of one of his great influences in ministry, one of the great encouragers. And he went up and talked to her after service and said, "Hey, I just want you to know, your dad was meant so much to me, and I'm sorry that he's passed." And she goes, "Yeah, we're all sad about it too, because it wasn't too long ago, and I'm sorry I wasn't able to reach out to him and all that more." But she said, "But I want to tell you how Dad finished. Dad finished strong." She said, while we were gathered around there in those last moments, his speech was taken away, and he could really just motion a little bit. And as we were sitting there, we were gathered all together, and he started kind of pointing to the bathroom. Well, after a little bit, we got the idea that he really wanted to drink water, and so he brought in a glass of water, my brother did, and then we tried to get him to drink it, but he wouldn't drink it. Instead, he pointed at my brother, and he wanted him to drink it. And so he drank a little bit of the water, and then he pointed at the sister, and he said, "I want you to drink it." And then she drank it. It wasn't too much longer. They figured out what Dad is doing is Dad wants us to have communion together. Even at the end, he was living out the promise and what was going to happen. He was ministering to his own family. Now let's get a little personal for me. It wasn't too long ago that I sat around my dad's bedside in a very, very intimate way with my siblings. And as we surrounded my dad's bedside there in the last moments, not knowing when that was going to be,
but we knew it was coming soon. We had all gotten home from church that Sunday, and it was typical for us to give Dad a report of where we'd been, of what we'd done, who we'd talked to, who we'd ministered, how church was, all those type of things. And we would surround Dad and tell him that. Luckily, he was able to speak a little bit and everything else. We didn't know Dad was going to die that day, but it was just tradition that we'd come around and we'd speak to Dad to give report because he couldn't go out and minister anymore. But in those final moments, as we cherished that together and sent him off with a big thank you for his blessing, we indicated that we were continuing to follow in that blessing and the promise of walking faithfully just as he did. There's importance there and understanding, because we need to walk our lives faithfully.
And being faithful to the promise till the finish. Finish strong.
Because someone behind you might be watching. Here's the thing for you and I.
We need to understand that Jesus Christ gives us the opportunity